Ukraine-Russia conflict has exposed a dependency that Europe is now trying to correct. Europe is dependent on gas and crude oil from Russia. With the sanctions that have been put in place, Europe finds itself looking for new energy partners. Europe needs to diversify away from its main source of supply, and this is where African countries may step in to fill the gap. The price of hydrocarbon-based commodities like crude oil and natural gas has risen sharply since the conflict started. The effects are being felt across the world, and particularly here on the continent. We're seeing the cost of refined petroleum products increase, along with higher electricity tariffs and costlier natural gas. So who could benefit from the gap created in this situation? Egypt and Algeria are already on the pipeline, so to speak, but a large majority of hydrocarbon-rich sub-Saharan African countries are either at the drawing board or still looking for partners to build the required infrastructure. Heavy hitters like Nigeria, Angola, and Libya are behind schedule on planned expansions to much-needed infrastructural equipment. Africa reportedly has 148.6 trillion cubic meters of proven gas reserves, more than 7% of the global reserves. In 2019, the European Union imported about 108 billion cubic meters of LNG from Africa, over 12 billion of which came from Nigeria. While African countries may be on the road to providing Europe with what it needs, is Europe also willing to invest in the vast hydrocarbon resources of the continent? So how can Africa take advantage of Europe's energy crisis? Let's see if we can get some answers on today's show. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun. Now joining me from Cape Town, South Africa is Craig Morkel. He's the chairman, South African Oil and Gas Alliance's Gas Economy Team, and he's also the CEO of Ikapa Energy. Craig, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, Africa. Bonjour, l'Afrique.
Fantastic to have you. So let's start with sort of like a foundation for this conversation in terms of what exactly is it that Russia supplies Europe that has now become the source of this crisis that may see African countries stepping into the gap?
Well, firstly, we have to analyze the relationships not only between Russia and Europe, but between Russia and its other trading partners, and then Europe and its other trading partners. In particular, the demand that there is in Europe for gas right now cannot be met by Russia and Russia alone. It has some gas flowing into Europe from other resources. So it is that portion of its demand in Europe that would not be supplied by Russia, that could potentially be filled by Africa and its oil and gas producing countries. Now, the opportunity, as you correctly pointed out in your introduction, is a function to some extent of the availability not only of the resource in Africa, but the infrastructure to produce it and then to transport it to markets such as Europe. That infrastructure is underdeveloped. Whilst the resource is there, it requires further investment. We have to ask ourselves the question, who owns oil and gas resources in Africa? Has African governments got the correct regulatory and legal framework in place to ensure that Africa decides where its gas goes to, where its oil and gas goes to, and not only its foreign partners that need to invest in African resources? And this is the key question that we have faced for since post-independence from our former colonial masters. And if one looks at the regulatory regimes throughout Africa, one would see that we have given away our rights to own, manage, and determine where and how that gas, oil and gas is sold. We need to take back that power, especially in this time of crisis, to say to our partners, we need a more fair partnership as Africa, in which we, with them, could make substantial contributions to the planet its people, prosperity, peace, and partnership, as the 17 Sustainable Development Goals encourage us to do.
Okay.
Now, the reason why I mention that as important, because we have to look at this in the broader context of global warming, right? And if our only consideration is the planet and not the other 4 Ps, people, prosperity, peace, and partnership, then there will be no need, according to that narrative, for any oil and gas, not only in Africa, but in Europe as well.
Okay, so I quickly want to ask you, as you mentioned at the beginning of this, Russia is just one of the suppliers that supplies the European Union and Europe, but it's a large part of it. So why is it not a situation where Europe or the European Union can then turn to its other partners and just simply ask them to increase their own supply at this point in time?
Correct. And so if one looks at the oil producing countries in OPEC and the gas producing countries in the global gas producing countries forum, we have some capacity that already exists that was turned down in terms of production capacity in those countries. It is a question of some of those taps being opened further so that oil and gas could flow to Europe. But it is also a function of the opportunity to now leverage the higher cost of oil and gas and its derivative products to then invest in those upstream and midstream resources. With the oil price being as high as it is right now, it does make it a lot more attractive to invest in the reopening of the taps and, of course, new infrastructure to increase capacity from oil-producing and gas-producing countries.
Okay, so let's look at this also beyond. We'll get back to the African aspect of this conversation, but quickly on the European Union. The Union is saying it is determined to reduce its dependency on the Russian supply even beyond the expiration of this conflict, whenever that may be. And in March, the EU announced plans to cut gas dependency by 2/3 this year. That's its gas dependency on Russia, and then completely end it by 2030. Now, Russia supplies an average of 380 million cubic meters of LNG, which amounts to around 140 billion cubic, or 45% of almost the EU's total gas consumption in a year. So even how realistic is the EU's own plan of reducing its dependency by 2/3 before the end of this year and almost cutting it completely in the next 8 years? Is that realistic? Because that would also allow us to know how much capacity African countries would need to build up to step into the gap.
Sure. I think it is unrealistic, to answer the question in short. I think there is therefore an opportunity for African countries to step in and fill the gap left by the other oil-producing countries that would try and fill the gap that Russia would leave over this period of time. So the key thing is to assess the volume and the timing of the demand in Europe, and then to ensure that the infrastructure that one develops does not become stranded assets and is flexible enough to meet the demand over the short to medium term, and then be applied in a different way in to supply other markets when the demand in Europe is filled by others, including possibly Russia coming back into the picture. So the key question that remains then is, what investment is required in Africa right now in the short term to take advantage of this supply gap in Europe? And then how could that infrastructure be developed in a flexible enough manner so that it could then be used to then transform Africa into becoming more of an oil user, an oil and gas user, than simply an oil and gas producer?
And I think you take me to a really interesting point when I was looking into this conversation. So it has been said that for African countries to plug this gap that exists right now, they would need a spare capacity of around 7.4 million barrels per day. And that's a spare capacity in addition to what we also need for our economies to continue to thrive. Both Angola and Nigeria, the top two producers for OPEC in Africa, have not even met their quotas throughout the majority of last year and into this year as well. So then where is this spare capacity to even come from? So when you look at it, does Africa really present a feasible alternative for the EU when we still haven't even met up to the OPEC quota and when this spare capacity part of the conversation comes into play?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to up our game as Africa, and not only Angola and Nigeria, but all other oil and gas producing countries in Africa. And those where discoveries have been made of possible and probable reserves, we need to get them to a state of provenness, and that will require investment. But again, I want to return to the regulatory regime issue because investment confidence is a function of regulatory certainty. And to what extent that certainty can attract investment and achieve Africa's socioeconomic developmental goals of no longer being simply resource rich and energy poor. Now, if one looks at the need for investment from outside of Africa, it means that we need to partner, that we give away some of our power, decision-making power, but one shouldn't see that as a new opportunity for colonialism. One needs to decolonize what's already there and say, what can we do to partner more fairly? Now, we can partner with those countries where there are where there is significant demand. We can also partner with competitor countries that are also oil and gas producers. My gut feeling says that it will be strategically more prudent to partner with countries that have demand for oil and gas more than to partner with countries that are already oil and gas producers. And by that I mean the major oil and gas companies that enter Africa's upstream and midstream space. We need to partner with them, but we need to do so on a more fair basis. And how much of the gas that we produce should then be allocated to Europe, and how much of that should be allocated to countries in Africa.
All right, Greg, let's go on a break. You mentioned infrastructure earlier, and I want us to take that into consideration with what's happening in North Africa, as well as the proposed, I will use the word proposed, TransSaharan gas pipeline. Those are very big infrastructure projects that are aiming to get to the heart of this issue. And of course, at the end of the day, will we see Europe also be willing to invest on the continent? And one other thing we can't forget, there are political connotations to this conversation as the chips have fallen and people, that means countries, have chosen sides when it comes to this Russia-Ukraine crisis. The conversation continues right after this. And still with me is Craig Morkel. He's the chairman, South African Oil and Gas Alliance's gas economy team. And in the conversation we've had so far, looking at how African countries can take advantage of the energy crisis that Europe is having, the issue of infrastructure has come up. Now let's look into this. So Craig, it appears that North Africa seems to sort of be taking the lead already when it comes to this conversation. Egypt and Algeria already export gas to parts of Europe, and the Trans-Mediterranean pipeline has some spare capacity to increase gas supplies. What do you expect to happen next? Because this one seems more like a plug and play part of it. Doesn't need so much development to get some results. So in the short to medium term, what do we expect to happen with the conversation involving Algeria and Egypt?
Well, I think any spare pipeline capacity should be utilized to the maximum as quickly as possible. Pipeline infrastructure is the cheapest way of transporting gas, but it depends on distance, right? When you get beyond a particular distance, and I mean, we see how long the pipelines are from Russia into Europe. But when one then looks at those oil and gas producing countries in Africa that are not connected to the pipeline as yet, then obviously LNG being transported by maritime vessels to Europe becomes an option. So then the question becomes whether we have enough liquefaction capacity at the African LNG export terminals. We certainly know that there are adequate LNG carrier vessels available. And then is there spare capacity at the LNG import terminals in Europe, such as Rotterdam, and in particular in Germany, right? We are aware that there are LNG import terminals that achieved an advanced stage of feasibility in their development in the Mediterranean, but were not implemented. And those could now also be fast-tracked by Europe, and they could then base their business case on the availability of LNG imports from Africa, in particular Angola, Nigeria, and any of those that will come online within the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. But the needs are more urgent than that.
Exactly.
And so there are short-term solutions that does not require fixed infrastructure. By that I mean that there are containerized LNG solutions that can be used at present to provide small to mid-scale volumes of gas. That could make a difference in Europe, especially for peak demand. Now, it doesn't require the type of immobile infrastructure that you would need in a conventional LNG export terminal or LNG import terminal. Another technology that also creates a quick win is what's called jettyless import terminals. A jetty is not required, but if you could picture this, an LNG carrier delivers to a port and runs a floating cryogenic pipe, flexible pipe, out to an onshore tank, and then discharges its LNG into an onshore tank. The onshore tank could simply be a buffer tank from which one could fill containers, and the containers could then be transported by road or rail to its off-takers. So these short-term technical solutions, which are highly flexible, are available immediately, but they do have limitations in terms of the volume that they could transport before it becomes too cumbersome, too complicated to use these modularized solutions. Okay. But they are available.
Okay, so I want us to touch on the TransSaharan gas pipeline, which maybe is remaining a pipeline dream right now. And this idea has been around since the 1970s. There's MOUs, there's a feasibility study, there's a joint venture agreement and more, but nothing really has moved forward. Is this still a viable economic option for Africa, not even in relation to the EU crisis right now, but even for the future, or is it going to remain a pipe dream for the near? Craig, what do you think?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I think we must future-proof all infrastructure, right? All infrastructure must not be based on the existence of a conflict that might resolve itself within the next few months, yes, or few years. We should look beyond that to a 20-year or 50-year horizon and develop our infrastructure with that end in mind. So if one begins from the end and work backward, what is it that we want in the end, and what is it that we need to do now incrementally towards achieving that particular goal? That is a function of master planning. And it's a function of master planning that needs to happen at an African, Pan-African level, under the AU, or by regional economic cooperation forums such as ECOWAS and others. In South Africa, we're doing that through SADC. We've completed the first stage of a regional gas master plan, where all of the infrastructure required in the short to long term is being mapped out, right? Now, on the pipeline, the TransSaharan pipeline, one of the key issues that investors would ask themselves is, what are the risks of this pipeline becoming a target of insurgents, political activity, and so on, terrorism. Yeah. So one needs to take that into account when one develops these pipeline infrastructure, not only on the basis of the good or bad relationships we might have between neighbors in Africa today, but also look at the long-term vision, the opportunity then to progress beyond a carbon-intensive economy to a low-carbon economy in Africa, in which gas might play a transitional role, perhaps beyond the date that others have committed to at COP26 last year. African countries might say, well, we are seeking exceptions for gas in terms of our COP26 commitments. And what's quite instructive here is that the EU has taken a decision since COP26, yes. And as a result of this crisis becoming worse now, it of sustainable energy to now include gas and nuclear, right? Okay. Before COP26, there was no gas in their master planning, and they would not support any gas infrastructure at all. Now, reality has hit home, and now gas is becoming more relevant, yes. And I suppose some of the oil products as well. Okay. Now, so we need to take note of that for our future planning.
Okay, so future-proof, our plans must be beyond immediate crisis and emergencies. So, Craig, I must ask you this before we wrap up, and I'll need to see if I can keep your answer to 1 minute. We can't also ignore the political factor in this conversation. We saw what happened when there was a United Nations General Assembly resolution. We had 28 out of 54 African countries who sided with Ukraine, and the rest either abstained, they were not present, or something else. So there are historic ties with Russia that African countries have, and many don't want to have to choose sides in this particular situation. Where do you think the chips will fall? Because there's also concern that if Europe presses its crisis level panic button, member states could then begin to hoard the remaining supply of fuel, which would have a devastating impact on the African continent. And that means EU refineries that help to move people, vehicles, and machines will then impact us. So in 1 minute, where do you think the chips will eventually fall as we continue to look at the short, medium, and long-term possibilities?
Well, firstly, let me say personally, and I believe on behalf of Sir Oge as well, we're against any war, right? And to be forced into a position where one has to choose is unfair to those who are not involved in a conflict. We are then expected to become proxies of either party to a conflict, which is unfair. What we is attempt to play a mediation role, through individual African countries and as the AU, so that we could say to our brothers and sisters globally, please.
Oh, and just at the tail end of the conversation, having some technical issues there, but even in the conversation around how Africa can find benefits or advantages in Europe's energy crisis, there are also political factors at play. Connections, historic connections to Russia as well as to the European Union. But as Craig has said, asking us to choose a side in a war that's not our own is rather unfair. But it's a conversation that won't stop now, because Russia is, of course, trying to continue to sell its products and asking countries who are interested to pay in its local currency. But we've seen the European Union said by 2030, they want to completely be off of Russian energy supplies. That's gas and crude oil. Now we're heading straight into NC4 to watch, and then we'll be wrapping up the show. And as we're talking about Russia and Europe, of course, energy supplies, crude oil is at the top of our list for NC4 to watch. Now, crude oil headed for back-to-back weekly retreats on plans for massive stockpile releases a demand-sapping virus outbreak in top importer China, and a hawkish turn from the U.S. Federal Reserve. WTI for May delivery fell to $95.67 a barrel, while Brent for June settlement shed 0.5% to $100.08 a barrel. Kenya Airways and South African Airways have announced plans to begin a search for an investor for the Pan-African airline group they aim to create next year. The campaign to attract a majority investor for a holding company will be staged in Africa, London, and the U.S., and the two carriers are also seeking to recruit a third member from West Africa, most likely in Nigeria, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, or Senegal. European and Asian coal importers are expected to join the scramble for alternative sources of the fuel as the European Union ban on Russian coal imports looms. But with top exporters Australia and Indonesia having already hit production limits and major producer South Africa constrained by logistics problems, some importers may struggle to maintain supply levels. And finally, Bitcoin plummeted for a fourth day as investors shied away from riskier assets in anticipation of the largest jump in U.S. interest rates in 3 decades. The correlation coefficient between Bitcoin and U.S. equities has risen in the last 90 days as investors become more risk-averse in response to the Federal Reserve's withdrawal of the pandemic-era stimulus that is credited with helping to fuel the ascent of cryptocurrency. And that's today's show. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to follow us on social media at News Central TV. Download our app, go to our website, and of course, watch us on the platforms we're available. My name is Tolu Lokwe Adela Rubalogun. See you over the weekend.